It was 2:14 in the morning when Angela Reynolds heard the baby monitor crackle for the third time that hour. She sat up in the dark, her back against the cold headboard, and stared at the small red light blinking on the nightstand. Her son, Elijah, was 3 months old, and for the last 2 weeks he had barely kept a bottle down. The doctors called it a viral infection that needed watching. Angela called it the loneliest month of her life. Her husband, Marcus Reynolds, a decorated staff sergeant, had been gone for 6 of those days on what he called additional training. She had stopped asking questions weeks ago because every question led to the same silence. That night, as Elijah's cries rose through the monitor, her phone lit up on the dresser with a text message that was never meant for her eyes. She almost didn't look. She told herself later that some small, tired part of her wanted to stay in the dark a little longer because the dark was easier than what was coming. But she looked anyway, and in that single glance, everything she had spent 3 years building with Marcus Reynolds began to come apart in her hands. The message was short. It was affectionate. It was signed with a name she had never heard him mention, a name that did not belong to any unit, any deployment, any training exercise he had ever described to her. Elijah's cries grew louder down the hall, and Angela sat frozen, phone in hand, while her son called out for a father who was 3 states away, and, she now understood, not alone. He swore an oath to his country. He broke one to his family. And when Angela finally picked up that phone again, hours later, with Elijah fed and finally asleep against her chest, she did not call a lawyer, and she did not call her mother. She called his commanding officer. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. What Angela did not know that night was that the call she was about to make would set off a chain of events far beyond a single marriage falling apart. Somewhere on a military base 600 miles away, a heavy wooden door with a small brass nameplate reading Colonel James Whitfield was about to open on a Monday morning that Marcus Reynolds would never forget. Boots would be seen beneath that door before the man wearing them ever said a word. And by the time this story is over, you will understand exactly why a sick baby, a blinking cell phone, and one mother's decision to make a single phone call would end up changing the lives of everyone connected to Staff Sergeant Marcus Reynolds forever. Tease. To understand how a marriage built on years of sacrifice ended with a phone call to a commanding officer, you first have to understand 3 people and the space between what each of them believed to be true. There was Angela Reynolds, a young mother who had given up her own career plans to follow her husband from base to base, believing that loyalty was something you built brick by brick, year by year. There was Marcus Reynolds, a man respected by his peers, admired by his soldiers, and trusted with responsibilities that most people never see. And there was a third name, one that would not mean anything to Angela until that night, a name belonging to a young woman named Danielle Carter, whose own story was far more complicated than anyone watching from the outside could have guessed. 3 questions will follow you through everything that comes next. Why did a man with everything to lose choose to walk away from a sick infant rather than come home? What did Angela know, or suspect, that made her skip the lawyer and go straight to the one person who could take away everything Marcus had worked for? And what was Colonel Whitfield about to discover behind that office door that would turn a private betrayal into an investigation with consequences no one saw coming? Some of what you are about to hear will surprise you. Some of it will make you angry. And some of it will make you question who the real victim in this story actually was, because the answer is not as simple as it appears in the first 10 minutes. Backstory. Angela and Marcus met the way a lot of military marriages begin, quietly, and almost by accident. She was 24, working the front desk at a physical therapy clinic near Fort Liberty, and he came in twice a week for a shoulder injury from a training exercise that never fully healed right. He was polite in a way that felt old-fashioned, the kind of man who said yes ma'am to women 20 years younger than his own mother. It took him 6 weeks to ask for her number, and when he finally did, he apologized for taking so long, telling her he didn't want to seem like he was rushing something that mattered. Angela liked that about him immediately. She had grown up watching her own parents' marriage fall apart from rushing, from moving too fast toward a life neither of them had actually agreed on, and Marcus's slowness felt, to her, like safety. They married 18 months later in a small ceremony at Angela's home church, the kind of wedding where half the guests wore dress blues and the other half were their Sunday best. Friends who knew them both back then describe a couple that seemed unusually solid for how young they were. Grounded, the kind of partnership people pointed to when they wanted to believe military marriages could work. Marcus's career moved steadily upward. He was the soldier other soldiers wanted leading them, calm under pressure, respected without needing to demand it. Angela built a life around his schedule the way so many military spouses learn to do, packing up apartments every 2 or 3 years, starting over in new towns, new jobs, new versions of a life that always belonged a little more to his career than to her own. The cracks did not appear all at once. They appeared the way most cracks do, slowly, in places no one thought to look. Marcus was promoted to a role that came with more responsibility, and, Angela would later realize, considerably more unsupervised time. He began traveling for what he called additional training, trips that grew longer and more frequent over the better part of a year. Angela noticed the change before she could name it, a kind of distance in his voice on the phone, a habit of stepping outside to take calls he used to take in the same room as her. She told herself it was stress. She told herself a lot of things during that year, because the alternative, the thing she could not yet bring herself to consider, was too heavy to carry while she was also carrying a pregnancy that had already turned out to be more difficult than either of them expected. Elijah was born 7 weeks early, in a hospital 2 hours from the nearest base housing, on a night Marcus was supposed to be home and was not. He arrived 17 hours later, after the worst of it had already passed, after Angela had spent a night alone in a NICU waiting room listening to machines she did not understand keep her son alive. He apologized. He held her hand. He told her it would never happen again, and for a while, Angela let herself believe him, because believing him was easier than facing what she had already started to suspect, that the man she married had begun living a second life somewhere she could not see. One phone call, one training trip, one late night at a time. By the time Elijah turned 3 months old, Angela had learned to read her husband's absences the way other people read weather patterns, watching for the small signs that told her a storm was coming before it arrived. That week, Marcus had been gone for 6 days on a trip he described only as additional training, a phrase Angela had come to distrust more than almost any other in his vocabulary. Elijah's fever had started on a Tuesday, mild at first, the kind of low-grade warmth a pediatrician says to simply monitor. By Thursday night it had climbed high enough that Angela sat up with him in the rocking chair for 4 straight hours, watching the numbers on the thermometer instead of sleeping, calling the nurse hotline twice before midnight, because she did not trust herself to know when a fever became an emergency. She called Marcus first. It went to voicemail, the way it usually did after 9 at night, a fact she had also learned to accept without asking too many questions. She called again an hour later, and then a third time, before finally giving up and calling her friend Renee instead, a fellow military spouse 2 streets over who had become, over the past year, the closest thing Angela had to family in a town 3 states from her own mother. Renee came over in her pajamas at 1 in the morning, sat with Angela and Elijah until the fever broke slightly, and stayed until the sun came up, because that was what military spouses did for each other when the men they married were somewhere else, doing something they could not fully explain. It was during that long night, somewhere between exhaustion and the particular clarity that comes from being awake far too long, that the text message arrived. Angela was not searching for anything. She was simply reaching for her phone to check the time when the screen lit up with a name she did not recognize, attached to a message affectionate enough that there was no mistaking what it meant. She read it once, then twice, then a third time, waiting for it to make sense in some innocent way it never did. Renee, sitting across from her with Elijah asleep against her shoulder, watched Angela's face change and asked quietly what was wrong. Angela did not answer right away. She simply turned the phone around and let Renee read it for herself. What happened over the following 2 hours would later become the part of this story people find hardest to believe, not because it was dramatic, but because of how calm Angela actually was. She did not scream. She did not throw anything. She sat at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold in front of her and made a decision that surprised even Renee, who had known her for over a year and considered herself familiar with how Angela handled a crisis. Angela did not call Marcus to confront him. She did not call a divorce attorney, though she had the number of one saved from a conversation with a co-worker months earlier, tucked away for a day she hoped would never come. Instead, She opened her laptop and searched for the general information line of Marcus's command. Renee asked her, more than once that morning, if she was certain that was the right move, if she wanted to wait until she had cooled down, until Elijah's fever had fully broken, until she had slept. Angela's answer stayed with Renee long enough that she repeated it later to anyone who asked how this whole story began. Angela said that she was done waiting for Marcus to decide when their family mattered enough to come first, and that if the only language he understood was consequence, then consequence was exactly what she intended to deliver. She dialed the number just after 9 that morning, was transferred twice, and finally reached a scheduling assistant who took her name, her husband's rank and unit, and told her that Colonel James Whitfield would return her call before the end of the day. He called at 4:40 that afternoon. Angela would later describe his voice as measured, careful, the voice of a man who had clearly taken calls like this before and understood exactly how much weight they could carry. She told him what she knew, calmly, factually, the way she might have described a car accident to an insurance adjuster, laying out dates and absences and the message she had read the night before without embellishing any of it. Colonel Whitfield listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he thanked her for calling, told her he took the matter seriously, and said the words that would echo through the following weeks of this story. He told her that Staff Sergeant Reynolds would be asked to report to his office first thing Monday morning, and that whatever she had told him would not simply disappear once the call ended. Monday morning came slower than any morning Angela could remember, and she spent most of it not knowing what was happening 2 hours away in Colonel Whitfield's office, only that something was. Marcus called her twice that day. She did not answer either time. What she would later learn, piecing it together from documents, from conversations with people who were in the building that morning, was that Marcus arrived at 0800 sharp, in uniform, expecting a routine check-in about his recent training schedule. He was not expecting Colonel Whitfield to already have a printed copy of his travel authorizations laid out on the desk, next to a separate folder Marcus did not recognize, one that had arrived from the finance office only the day before, flagged for review by a name attached to Angela's original phone call. What Colonel Whitfield found in that folder was not simply evidence of an affair, though the affair itself was confirmed within the first 20 minutes of the meeting. It was evidence that Marcus had been submitting travel and separation paperwork for training exercises that, according to at least 2 other units on base, had never actually taken place, or had taken place for a fraction of the time claimed. The financial trail led backward nearly 10 months, overlapping almost exactly with the timeline Angela had described on the phone, the same stretch of time she remembered as growing distance, missed calls, and a husband who seemed to exist increasingly somewhere she could not follow. Marcus, according to 2 people present that day, went pale before he said a single word in his own defense. The name attached to the text message Angela had read that Thursday night was Danielle Carter, a 26-year-old logistics specialist stationed at a facility 2 hours from the base where Marcus was assigned. What made this detail far more serious than a simple affair, in the eyes of the investigators who took over the case that week, was that Danielle fell, however indirectly, within a chain of professional contact connected to Marcus's role, a detail that shifted the entire nature of the inquiry from a personal matter into something the military takes considerably more seriously. Danielle herself, when contacted, told investigators something that would complicate the story even further, something Angela did not learn until nearly 3 weeks later, sitting across from a caseworker in a small office that smelled like old coffee and industrial carpet cleaner. Danielle told investigators that Marcus had informed her, more than 8 months earlier, that his marriage was already over, that he and Angela were separated and finalizing paperwork, and that the only reason he had not moved out of the family home yet was to avoid disrupting a pregnancy Angela was struggling through. She had believed him completely. She had met his cousin, or a man introduced to her as his cousin, at a dinner in a city 3 hours from where Angela lived. She had, by every account she gave investigators, believed she was building a future with a man who was honest with her about everything except the one thing that mattered most. When she was shown a copy of Angela's original marriage certificate, dated well before any of the claims Marcus had made to her, she reportedly sat in silence for nearly a full minute before asking to see it again. The picture that emerged over the following weeks was more complicated than either woman had first understood. Marcus had not simply been unfaithful. He had built two separate versions of his own life and managed to keep both women believing a story that was, in each direction, almost entirely untrue. To Angela, he was a devoted husband dealing with the ordinary strain of military service. To Danielle, he was a nearly divorced man finally free to build something honest. To his command, he was a decorated staff sergeant whose paperwork, until Angela's phone call, had never drawn a second look. Investigators would later describe the falsified travel claims as the most damaging piece of evidence in the case, not because of the dollar amount involved, though it exceeded $11,000 over 10 months, but because it proved intent in a way infidelity alone never could. The formal proceedings against Marcus Reynolds took just over 2 months, moving through a process most civilians never see up close, one that runs on paperwork, hearings, and a chain of command Angela had once simply thought of as her husband's employer. She was called to testify once, briefly, about the timeline she remembered, the dates, the trips, the night Elijah's fever spiked while his father was 400 miles away with a woman who believed she was his future wife. Angela later said that testifying was easier than she expected, not because it did not hurt, but because by that point the hurt had already happened, and all that remained was telling the truth about it out loud, in a small room, to people whose job was simply to listen and record. Marcus was found to have violated multiple provisions of military conduct, including the falsification of official records, and was reduced in rank as part of a resolution that avoided a full court-martial in exchange for his resignation from service under other than honorable conditions. It was not the outcome some people watching this story unfold might have expected, not prison, not headlines. But for a man who had built his entire identity around his career, the loss of rank and a quiet, permanent mark on his record carried a weight of its own. Danielle Carter, found to have had no knowledge of the deception at the time, was not disciplined for the relationship itself, though colleagues say she requested a transfer to a different base within a month of the investigation closing, unwilling to remain anywhere near a story that had made her, however unfairly, part of the gossip on post. Angela filed for divorce 3 weeks after the investigation concluded. She did not fight for the house, or the car, or anything beyond what she needed to raise Elijah on her own, a decision Renee tried gently to talk her out of, worried Angela was leaving money on the table she would need later. Angela's answer, the one Renee still repeats when people ask how her friend managed to walk away with her head high, was that she had not made that first phone call to Colonel Whitfield to win anything. She had made it because her son deserved a mother who did not spend the rest of her life waiting by a phone for a man who had already decided, long before that Thursday night, that his family was not the life he actually wanted. Elijah turned 1 this past spring. Angela posted a single photo from his birthday, a small cake, a handful of family members, no father in the frame, and a caption that simply read, "We made it." She has not spoken publicly about Marcus since the divorce was finalized, and by every account from people close to her, she has built a quiet, steady life 2 hours from where this story began, closer now to her own mother, closer to people who knew her before any of this happened. What stays with almost everyone who has followed this story is not the affair itself, which is, in the end, a story as old as marriage. It is the image of a woman sitting alone at a kitchen table at 9 in the morning, coffee going cold, choosing not silence and not revenge, but the truth, delivered calmly, to the one person who could not look away from it. Was justice really served in this story, or did Marcus Reynolds simply lose a career while walking away largely intact from the 2 lives he broke apart to build it? Would you have made that same call, to a commanding officer, to a lawyer, to no one at all, and sat with it in silence instead? Let us know what you would have done in the comments below. And if this story affected you the way it affected everyone on our team while we were putting it together, stay close, because the story we're bringing you next is one you will not want to miss. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss one of our upcoming true stories.